Richard Rothstein is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He lives in California, where he is a fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Please welcome Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to meet with you this morning. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, and then went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, succeeded in persuading the Supreme Court to end segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown versus Board of Education decision gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of civil rights activists. They engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle. Others were very severely injured. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement pretty much persuaded the country, not everybody, but pretty much persuaded the country that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful not only to Blacks, but to whites as well, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. With that understanding, it succeeded in the 1960s to end segregation in public accommodations, in transportation, in much employment. And then in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But then, at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. I imagine that some of you have lived in places other than Syracuse as well. But every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all Black, or mostly Black. How could it be? If we came to understand that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both Blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society, how could we leave untouched the biggest segregation of all? We're an apartheid society when it comes to neighborhoods. Well, partly it's, I guess, because undoing residential segregation is hard. If we passed an ordinance prohibiting segregation in restaurants, the next day anybody can go to any restaurant. We pass an ordinance prohibiting segregation in neighborhoods, and the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, Blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republicans, we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for refusing to redress this biggest segregation of all. And that excuse goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation forms that we ended in the 1950s and 60s, those were all created by government. If the federal government was requiring segregation, that was a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, a civil rights violation, something as Americans we all have an obligation to remedy. If state and local governments were requiring segregation, that was a violation of the 14th Amendment, also a civil rights violation, and also something we have an obligation to remedy. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. It wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That just sort of happened naturally. It happened because, bigoted white homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe because private actors, real estate agents, developers, banks, insurance companies all discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all because of income differences. African Americans, on average, have lower incomes than whites, and many of them can't afford to move to middle-class neighborhoods. All of these bigoted, discriminatory factors, self-choice, income differences, this is what created residential segregation. And if it happened naturally, happened by accident, it can only unhappen naturally. It can only unhappen by accident. Government wasn't involved in this, and the Constitution doesn't prohibit private individuals from being discriminatory. Well, I spent much of my time up until the time I wrote this book, The Color of Law, about which I'm speaking today, writing about education policy. I didn't know much about housing. I came to understand in the 1990s and 2000s, some of you may remember that time, gets farther and farther away the longer we are alive, but in the 1990s and 2000s, we had a national education theory that you may recall. We understood that there was an achievement gap between Black and white children. Black children on average achieve in school at lower levels than white children. And we told ourselves that the reason for that achievement gap was that teachers of Black children were lazy. They didn't try very hard. And if only we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory, but this was a national consensus supported even by the civil rights movement. It was enacted into national law in 2001. We passed something called the No Child Left Behind law, which required schools to test children every year and report their average scores by race. And the idea behind this law was if teachers saw that their African American children were achieving at lower levels than white children, they would be so ashamed that they would work harder and the achievement gap would disappear. This was a ludicrous theory. I wrote column after column about it. I was a New York Times columnist during part of this time. And the reason we have an achievement gap is not because there are lazy teachers. Of course, some teachers are lazy. Some real estate agents are lazy. Well, maybe not, but some teachers are lazy, not too many of them. Most of them work very hard. They try hard. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many African American children come to school with social and economic challenges that inhibit their ability to learn. So I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at a much higher rate than middle-class children in suburban neighborhoods. They have asthma at such a higher rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more industry nearby, more trucks driving by their homes, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't to be up at night wheezing and then coming to school the next day drowsy. And if you have two groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial composition, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement. Not every child will have lower achievement, but on average lower achievement because it's going to be a sleepier group. Well, asthma doesn't have a big effect on the achievement gap. It's a small effect, but then you begin to think of all of the other challenges that African American children in urban neighborhoods have that interfere with their learning. Asthma, lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ, homelessness, economic insecurity. You begin to add all of these up and you pretty much explain the achievement gap. And then I began to realize it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. It's another thing entirely if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges. How can such a school ever be expected to have the same average achievement as a school where children come healthy, well-rested, from economically secure homes, well-nourished? You can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you pass. As I say, we passed the No Child Left Behind law. It's now 20 years later. The law said that in 7 years, the achievement gap would disappear. It's still there, about the same level as it was in 2001. The only thing that the No Child Left Behind Act accomplished was it gave schools an incentive to abandon a well-rounded curriculum so they could devote excessive time to drilling children in test-taking skills. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with those kinds of disadvantages. We call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So as an education policy analyst, I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. That's how I came to this topic. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated a program in 2 school districts, Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky. In both of those districts, parents were given the choice of which school in the district their child would attend, but if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a parent whose child would not do so. So if you had an all-white, a mostly white school, you had a couple of places left, and both a black and a white child applied for one of the last remaining places, black child would be given a little bit of preference in order to help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program. You don't have 1 or 2 places left very often, and a black and a white child both apply for the last remaining place. But the Supreme Court evaluated this, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained that it's true. He said the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. He said the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. He was right about that. And then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods in Seattle and Louisville were segregated. The term he used was de facto, because of the reasons I described before: private prejudice, income differences, people wanting to live with each other of the same race. He said government had nothing to do with the segregation of Seattle and Louisville. And if government wasn't involved, it's against the Constitution for government to try to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville, one of those 2 cities, some years before. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. That friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single family home, but no realtor would show him one or sell him one. And so the white homeowner in this single family suburb of Shively bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend. When the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white residents surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me like de facto segregation. The police, the prosecutors, the criminal justice system, these are agents of state government. It's a violation of the Constitution, a violation of the 14th Amendment that's never been remedied, that we, all of us Americans, have never undertaken an obligation to remedy. I then began to look into it further, and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases, and I'm not exaggerating when I use those numbers, hundreds and hundreds of cases of police protected, sometimes police organized and led, mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. It wasn't restricted to border states like Kentucky. It was in New York. It was in Maryland. It was in Pennsylvania, Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco. In all of these places, the police were engaged in driving African Americans out of white neighborhoods with protected violence of mobs. Well, I then began to look into it further, and I found it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that's responsible for the segregation that we have in this country today, but there were many, many policies of federal, state, and local governments, all designed, racially explicit policies, designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another anywhere in any metropolitan area of this country. Well, let me, in the brief time I have with you this morning, describe one or two of the most powerful policies that the federal government followed to ensure that we be a segregated society. Perhaps the most powerful was a policy followed by the FHA and VA in the immediate post-World War II period, designed to move the entire white working class and middle class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs like that one I described before in Louisville. This was a racially explicit program of the FHA and VA. At the time, we were not a suburban country. Suburbanization came later. White working class and middle class families were living in urban areas. We were a manufacturing economy at the time, making things. Factories needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts, ship their final products. The workers who worked in those factories, as well as the people who worked in the banks and the other service industries that service those manufacturing facilities, they all had to live reasonably close to those factories. Most of them didn't have automobiles at that time. They could walk to work or maybe take short streetcar rides. We had some integration, much more integration in that period than we have today, much, much more. But the federal government decided it was going to move the white working class population out of those urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. And you're familiar with these suburbs that were created. They were created in every metropolitan area, yours as well as every other one. The most famous of them probably is east of New York City, Levittown. You've probably heard of it. 17,000 homes built in the post-World War II period. The builder, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to buy the land and to build 17,000 homes in one community. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do so. They thought this was a crazy idea. As I said, we were in a suburban country at the time, and they didn't think anybody was going to live in these places, would want to live in these places. The only way that Levitt could buy the land and build these homes was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting its plans, including the architectural design of the homes, the materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets, and an FHA required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required that he place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. This was written federal policy. Maybe you're familiar with the underwriting manual that the FHA distributes to appraisers all over the country. Did at that time, describing to appraisers what characteristics they would consider when recommending or not recommending the application of a builder for federal bank guarantees for his loans to create a subdivision. The underwriting manual said explicitly you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan for a development that was going to include African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even build an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. Every one of these suburbs that was created by federal policy with that kind of restriction was a constitutional violation, something that we have never remedied. Well, the white working class, returning war veterans, many of them, middle-class families who bought these homes under the auspices of the FHA or VA, bought them inexpensively. These were inexpensive homes. Levittown at the time, and same thing is true of suburbs all over the country. Homes cost about, in today's inflation-adjusted money, about $100,000. That's twice national median income. Anybody with a job in the post-war economy, white or black, could afford to buy a home for $100,000 with a job. Returning war veterans, black and white, were required to make no down payment, but African Americans are prohibited from exercising that right, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs by federal policy. Well, those homes, as you know, no longer cost $100,000. I don't know what they cost in Syracuse. I imagine $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 perhaps. In some parts of the country, they cost $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the equity they gained from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used that wealth to send their children to college, use it to take care of temporary emergencies, maybe unemployment, maybe a temporary medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit written federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, this program bears major responsibility for all of the racial inequality that we have in this country today. African American family incomes today are about 60% on average of white family incomes. You would think that if the family income ratio was 60%, African American household wealth would also on average be about 60% of white wealth. But in reality, while African American family incomes are 60% of white incomes on average, African American household wealth is now about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal policy that created the segregation of the suburbs, the white noose that surrounds every city. Unconstitutional federal policy that we have an obligation to remedy and never have done so. Well, that wealth gap is responsible, as I indicated a minute ago, for much of the racial inequality we have in this country today, because it locks African Americans into urban neighborhoods without being able to afford the down payment that's necessary to buy a home in a middle-class neighborhood. That wealth gap that locks them into these neighborhoods is responsible for the achievement gap in schools, as I described earlier. It's responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, in part because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods. Less access to grocery stores that sell fresh food, more pollution. It's responsible in part for the mass incarceration of young African American men that is greater than any time before in American history. I'm not suggesting that no police officer would ever abuse a young man if it weren't for racial segregation, but it's much, much worse because of our segregation. If we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs in the formal economy, no access to the transportation to get to those jobs, no access to the schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic disadvantages of their pupils. If you concentrate young men in neighborhoods like that, the police are inevitably going to be engaged in confrontations with them. The police are going to be adopting tactics of control rather than protection because of this concentration of the most disadvantaged people in our society. And finally, the wealth gap that we created with this housing policy and the inequality that results is, I think, in large part responsible for the very, very dangerous and frightening political polarization that we have in this country today. It's greater than any time since perhaps the 1850s, before the Civil War. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other, that we have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other? How can we develop a common national identity on that basis? Well, there were many, many other policies that federal, state, and local governments followed in order to preserve and create the segregation that we know today. One I'll mention that you may misunderstand is public housing. I misunderstood it before I did this research. Most of us think of public housing as a place where poor people live. Lots of mothers with single mothers with children, lots of those young men I talked about before without jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the New Deal, in the Depression, the Great Depression, during the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Public housing was not for poor people. We had at the time in the Depression about a 25% unemployment rate. Public housing was not for the 25% who were unemployed. It was for the 75% who had steady jobs, could afford to pay the full cost of the public housing and their rent. There were no subsidies. The government built the housing and then recouped its costs by collecting rent. That's who public housing was designed for. The first agency to build civilian public housing in this country was a New Deal agency called the Public Works Administration. Everywhere it built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, creating segregation frequently where it hadn't previously existed. You may recall a few minutes ago, I talked about how there were many integrated urban neighborhoods simply because if a factory district employed both Black and white workers, they had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods. I'm not suggesting that every other home was a different race, but broadly integrated neighborhoods. Public housing frequently segregated those neighborhoods for the first time. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, perhaps you've read him, perhaps you've heard of him, if not. He wrote in his autobiography, The Big C, that he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. That's not how we think of Cleveland, Ohio today as being an integrated place. But he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation with that and other projects elsewhere in Cleveland, a segregation pattern that exists still to this day. In my book, The Color of Law, I like where I can to use as examples self-satisfied, smug places that think perhaps they're better than other places in the country, better than Syracuse. One of them I talk about is Cambridge, Massachusetts. I imagine you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white, half Black. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, and the federal government built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation with that and with other segregated projects in the Boston area that created a pattern of segregation that still exists today. The West Coast had very few African Americans living on the West Coast before World War II. The migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into the West Coast took place during World War II, when hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war plants that hadn't existed prior to the war. They overwhelmed the communities where the war plants were located. If the government wanted the ships, the tanks, the airplanes, the jeeps to be produced, it had to find housing for these workers, and it did. Everywhere it built housing for war workers all over the country. But in the West Coast, I'm using as an example because it's such a good example because there were so few African Americans there before World War II, so there were no patterns of segregation there. Everywhere the government built housing, it built segregated housing for war workers who were working in the same war plants, but who were living separately by government program. In San Francisco, the federal government built 5 projects, 4 for whites only working in shipyards, 1 for African Americans. That project was placed in a neighborhood that later became the African American neighborhood of San Francisco. It wasn't beforehand. Across the bay in Berkeley, California, the government built projects for workers in shipyards there as well. For the white workers, the project was along the residential area near shopping. For the Black workers, it was in the industrial area along the railroad tracks. This is how segregation was created, not only in Northern California, but in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast. Well, The policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. The policy experts talk about them all the time. What's missing is not ideas about policy. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to make it uncomfortable not to implement these policies because there's no political support for them today. Let me give you an example of what a constitutionally required remedy would be if we had the political will to do it. I mentioned before the suburbs that were created, a place like Levittown, for example. I told you that the homes there sold for $100,000 when they were created in 1948, 49, 50. Well, homes in Levittown now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that said, okay, African Americans, you're now free to move to Levittown and any of these other suburbs that we excluded you from prior to 1968. But these suburbs are no longer affordable to working class families of either race unless they have down payments from their homes, from their parents or grandparents. The Levittown is now, as a result of the Fair Housing Act, about 2% African American, 1 to 2% African American. It's in a broader neighborhood that's about 15% African American. Some African Americans, of course, this is where that 1 to 2% come from, can afford to buy homes for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. That's, by the way, it's about 7 times national median income as compared to twice national median income when those homes first came up for sale. So some can afford to do it, but not many. The only way they can do it is if they have very, very good jobs and down payments from the wealth they've inherited. Well, what the federal government should be doing to remedy this blatant constitutional violation is buying up homes for sale in Levittown at market rates as they come up for sale and reselling them to African Americans at deeply discounted rates. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very explicit constitutional violation. We've never undertaken anything like it. There are some banks that are now providing a nominal, very small down payment assistance to African Americans to buy homes that they otherwise couldn't afford, but we've never undertaken the kind of effort that's necessary to undo the segregation that we created. We also have policies at the low end of the income scale that perpetuate segregation today. They're no longer racially explicit like the ones we implemented in the 20th century were, but they still reinforce segregation. You've probably heard of the Section 8 voucher program. The Section 8 voucher program is a subsidy to lower income families that provides them with the difference between 30% of their income, their wages, their wage income, and the median rent in their broad metropolitan area. It reinforces segregation because you don't have to be a genius to figure out that if you're subsidizing to afford the median rent, it's going to be too low to afford to rent an apartment in a higher opportunity neighborhood that might not be low income segregated. And it's actually too high to rent in a low income segregated neighborhood. So landlords in those neighborhoods exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. Well, we can easily change that if we had the will. There are a few jurisdictions that have changed it. A few jurisdictions are starting to increase the voucher amount for Section 8 voucher holders who are disproportionately African American, not all of them, but disproportionately African American, increase the voucher amount for households that choose to live in higher opportunity places, less segregated places, and lower the voucher amount for families who choose to live in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. This should be a national program. It's not. It's experimental in very few places because we don't have the political will to enact it. Well, I'm now writing a second book, a new book that follows on The Color of Law. It's a book about what local activists, local engaged citizens can do to begin the process of redressing segregation in their own communities as a way of building towards more of a national understanding of the necessity of enacting such policies. As I work on this book, I'm occasionally writing articles to that take from the work that I'm doing. I've written a couple of them, a few of them so far. I'll be continuing to do others. I don't know, Christine, if you want to follow up with members of this seminar, but if you want to collect names of anybody who would like to be on a list to receive these ongoing articles or the past ones about remedies, I'd be glad to put them on that distribution list. I'll also send you, if you're going to do a follow-up email, I'll send you some of the articles that have already been published about the remedies that we should be enacting. With that, I think I should conclude, and I'd be glad to take whatever questions, and I hope as much as discussion as we can. And if you don't have questions, I can talk for years about this.
I'm not seeing any questions yet.
Oh. Well, shall I talk some more?
Sure.
All right, well, let me give you another example of a policy that today, and this is particularly Syracuse. Actually, one of those articles I wrote was about Syracuse. It was in the New York Times, I think 2 years ago, a little bit more than 2 years ago. Throughout the country, African Americans today, if they own homes in low-income segregated neighborhoods, and many do, although the home ownership rate for African Americans is much lower than it is for whites, there are still many who do. 40% of all African American families own their own homes, compared to 70% of whites. Throughout the country, African American homeowners pay property taxes at a higher rate relative to their market value of their homes than whites do. They bear a disproportionate burden for financing schools and libraries and fire departments and other institutions that are supported by property taxes. The reason is not a racially explicit policy, but once you have two groups of people who are different in their social and economic circumstances, any policy you implement is going to have a different impact on those two groups of people. And in most cases, it's going to harm the less advantaged group more. Well, in many places, and Syracuse is one that I wrote about. You may recall a couple of years ago, there was an expose in your local media about how Syracuse had not done a citywide reassessment of properties for quite a while. I think, as I recall, it was 25 years. Maybe I have that wrong, but in any event, for quite a while, they hadn't done a reassessment. Well, if you delay doing a citywide, systematic reassessment of property, not for racial reasons, just because, oh, maybe it's expensive to do a reassessment for whatever reason. If you delay, typically white properties, homes owned by whites, appreciate in value more rapidly than homes owned by African Americans, by Black families. Homes in white neighborhoods appreciate faster. Well, if that's the case, then the assessed value of a home in a white neighborhood is going to be farther below its market value than the assessed value of a home in a Black neighborhood. The result is that homeowners in white neighborhoods are paying property taxes at a rate that's farther below the market value of their homes than Black families are. This is systematic nationwide. And this is not the only reason. There are other reasons why property assessments are discriminatory in effect. Assessors, unlike appraisers, can't go into a home. And so all they can do is estimate the value of a home based on external characteristics. They assume that a home, a 2-bedroom, 1-bath home is going to have the same value in any neighborhood. Well, I'm exaggerating a little bit, it's oversimplifying, not exaggerating, oversimplifying a little bit. They make some adjustments, but it's, as you know, a home with the same physical characteristics, excuse me, square footage, number of bedrooms, etc. A home in a white neighborhood is going to have more expensive internal amenities. better appliances, more upkeep than a home in a lower income neighborhood. The result is, for that reason also, the assessed values of white homes are going to be lower relative to market value than the assessed value of Black homes. Well, for all these reasons, African Americans have been paying property taxes. Hello? Somebody should turn off their, should mute their mic. African Americans are paying property taxes at a higher rate than whites. Well, the African American homeowners are due refunds for this years and years of overpayment. And this has been going on. If you read my book, The Color of Law, you'll see that I describe this going on as early as the 1970s. The federal government in the 1970s investigated this and found in cities all over the country, African Americans were paying too much property tax relative to whites. They're owed refunds. No jurisdiction, none, has made refunds to African Americans for this widely acknowledged problem. It's wasn't just acknowledged by the federal government in the 1970s. It's acknowledged by county assessors around the country. They just don't know what to do about it. The assessors can't make the refunds. They just assign the values. It's the other city agencies that depend on these funds that should be making the refunds, and there's been no effort to do so. So that's another example of the kind of policy that's necessary if we really wanted to redress the segregation that we've created. Christine,
Mr. Rothstein, yes, we do.
Good, okay.
Okay, since your book has come out, what, if any, response have you had from the federal government?
Well, let me say that my book is one of a number of books that have called attention to our history of segregation. And we have a more accurate and passionate discussion now about race than we ever have had before in American history. And that's true of federal officials as well as state and local officials, as well as real estate agents and developers and so forth. We've never had such a profound understanding of this. But as I said, there's no political will yet to transform that understanding into direct action, because it's going to be tough. It's going to require sacrifice. For example, the last example I gave, if we're going to fix this problem of discriminatory assessments, we're going to have to reduce the assessments in African American neighborhoods and increase them in white neighborhoods, since you need to raise the same amount of money with a more equitable assessment system. Well, that requires a political will that we don't yet have. So there's no political will at the federal level to do anything about this. We hear lots of talk about it, but no political will. This is, the Trump administration came into office vowing to challenge zoning rules in suburban communities that effectively excluded minority families with single family restrictions, large lot sizes, and so forth. It vowed to do that. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, said that was going to be his mission. Well, that was said for the first month or two of the administration, and then we never heard anything further about it because there's no political support for it. So yes, there's wide understanding of federal officials about this, but without a new civil rights movement, we're not going to see that translated into action.
Thank you. I have, what are your impressions of the relocation restructuring of Route 81 through Syracuse? Not sure if you know about that.
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay, what are some policies local communities can introduce to address the inequities of the past?
Policies that local communities can, well, yeah, and let me go back to the previous question I didn't answer. I don't know anything about the specifics of Syracuse. But I do know, and there's a chapter in The Color of Law that describes this, that when the interstate highway system was created in the 1950s, local officials with a racially explicit intent designed the spurs that go through cities to demolish African-American neighborhoods. They rated them specifically for the purpose of demolishing African-American neighborhoods. And I have quotations in the color of law that demonstrates how explicit this intention was. And this happened throughout the country. The example I use in the book is Miami, Florida. But if that's similar to what happened in Syracuse, you can take that as an example. I'm sorry, the question that I was supposed to answer, what was that? Oh, local policies. Well, I've indicated a couple of them. Perhaps the most important one is to abolish zoning rules that preserve suburban neighborhoods as all white enclaves. I'm not talking about building low-income housing in suburban neighborhoods. We should be building housing that's affordable to middle-class families, to working-class families. Many African Americans could afford to purchase less expensive housing in neighborhoods that are now too expensive. They've grown too expensive. They weren't when they were created. We should be building duplexes, townhouses, mixed income housing throughout the community. It doesn't take away from community character. So changing the zoning rules that prevent that kind of thing is one thing a local jurisdiction can do, a local community can do. I mentioned before the changes that can be made in the Section 8 voucher program. That affects lower income families, and that's something that's within the power of a local housing agency. It doesn't have to be done at the federal level. We also have a program of subsidy. The biggest subsidy for lower income housing is not the Section 8 program. It's something called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. And that program is a subsidy to developers to build housing for low income families. It reinforces segregation today. It reinforces segregation because most projects that use the low income housing tax credit are placed in existing low income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. Developers would rather place them there. For one thing, they have few opportunities in higher opportunity places because of those zoning rules. Secondly, if you place a project that includes low-income families who would be disproportionately, not entirely, but disproportionately African-American, if you place it in a low-income neighborhood, you don't have to hold 100 community meetings explaining why you're bringing Black and brown people into a white neighborhood. Land is cheaper. It's easier to rent that way because you can put a sign in the window and eligible low-income families can walk by and see the for rent sign. One thing the local communities can do is insist that the allocation of those low-income house tax credits take into account a diversity of types of places where the units are located. I'm not saying we shouldn't locate any of those units in low-income neighborhoods. Every neighborhood should have better housing. But right now we're placing an overwhelming number of share of them in low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing the segregation. And local communities can insist that a larger share be placed in higher opportunity communities.
Next question, are there any initiatives in New York State to reduce landlord Section 8 discrimination?
Well, again, I'm not an expert in New York State. I'm trying to focus on a national problem. The same thing happened everywhere. I use examples when I can from different places, like the example of Syracuse's property assessment system, but I'm not familiar specifically with New York State. There are many communities in this country. Well, no, that's an exaggeration. There are some communities in this country that prohibit discrimination against holders of Section 8 vouchers. As they prohibit landlords from saying, we're not going to rent to you because you have a voucher. That is not well enforced, but we have places, I think New York might be one of them, I'm not sure. Certainly New York City is, I don't know if it's a statewide rule. But every place, this should be a national policy. We should prohibit discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. Landlords being permitted to say, we're not going to rent to you simply because you have a subsidy from the federal government.
Next question, what do you think about reparation payments and perception of fairness and unfairness by citizens?
Well, let me take the first part of that question first. I don't use the term reparations. I think, if you call every little thing that you do reparations, it makes the term meaningless, and that's what's happening. Everybody who wants to do something to redress segregation, no matter how small, calls it reparations. But there are many, many policies that we should apply that to redress segregation. And if you want to call them reparations, that's fine. If you want to call, for example, I talked before about a down payment assistance to African Americans and subsidies to permit them to buy homes for which they were unconstitutionally excluded. If you want to call that reparations, go ahead. I call it a remedy, a redress, and I prefer to reserve the term reparations for what it initially meant, which is a national program that really is significant in the way in which it redresses segregation.
Thank you. How has your book and research impacted policy? Thank you. Great topic and speaker.
Well, I guess that last thing wasn't a question. Well, as I said, there are many, many communities that are taking small steps now to redress segregation in the absence of the kind of political support that would be necessary for large steps. So and it's, again, I don't want to take credit for my book. There are many, many contributors to the new awareness about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. We had 20 million Americans participate in Black Lives Matter demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020. They didn't participate because of my book, but these things all come together and contribute. And that awareness has led to some small efforts in some places to take steps in the right direction. There are some places, as you know, that have abolished exclusionary zoning, the single family zoning, and permitted duplexes or triplexes to be built on single family lots, the kinds of buildings that would blend into a residential community. There are, I mentioned a minute ago, places that prohibit discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. So we're taking small steps in a lot of places, but we need much more political will if we're going to take significant steps to redress segregation.
So this looks like it's true false. There are some listening that agree with what was and is being done in this country. That's why things get perpetuate. That's why these things perpetuate. 99% of all white people want it that way. Systemic is the word, true or false?
Well, I think we're a deeply polarized country, as I mentioned earlier. I think 99% is wildly exaggerated, but there certainly are many white people who are content not to redress segregation. That's why we need a more active civil rights movement to raise the temperature of this issue, to create the political will to do it. But let me just say again, that 20 million people who participated in those Black Lives demonstrations in 2020, most of the participants were white. Most of the participants were white. It's unheard of in the history of this country, unheard of in the history of this country. The demonstrations were mostly led by African Americans, but most of the participants were white. What's necessary is not to go home after those demonstrations and put a Black Lives Matter sign in the window and think you've accomplished something. What's necessary is moving from those demonstrations and the awareness of the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow that they reflected, and begin to organize into political movements that will press for policy change.
Could a person request a refund individually, such as in a new assessment? Will they be able to take this to the county assessor's office to have it done?
Yes, assessments can always be appealed. And assessors typically grant appeals on an individual basis, a token amount that's easy to adjust the property assessment by a small amount in order to get rid of the annoyance of having to address the appeal. And so appeals are frequently successful. The data show that they're more often successful for white homeowners than for black homeowners, because like everything else, we have a discriminatory in effect system. But yes, you can appeal your property assessment, but the appeals do not get to the magnitude that's necessary to redress the serious discrimination that was created, and that's still being created today by the discriminatory assessments, discriminatory in effect, not in intent.
You speak of political will. What about banks and their will to make changes?
Well, yes, it's banks, it's real estate agencies, it's developers. One of the articles I wrote in the Times about a year and a half ago now, I guess, and Christine, I don't know, do you have an email distribution? I can send this to you if you like.
Yes.
I identified a community in California. Like I said, I pick examples from all over the country. A community in California that was created in the 1940s as an all-white community. And I identified, and it's still all white today, all white. I identified the bank, the realtor, and the developer who created that as an all-white segregated community. And I want to emphasize at a time when African Americans could easily have afforded to buy homes in that community. They can't afford to buy them now. Nobody in California can afford to buy a home unless they have wealthy parents. That's a different story. But they could have afforded to do it then. Well, the bank was a small bank. It's now been absorbed, by it merged and was acquired. It's now part of Wells Fargo. The real estate agent was a small local realtor. It's now part of Coldwell Banker. And the developer is still in existence today in that community, operating a very, very profitable high-end shopping mall. And what I wrote in this article is each of these institutions, Wells Fargo, Coldwell Banker, and this development company, have an obligation to make substantial contributions to subsidize the purchase of homes by African Americans who could have afforded, I want to emphasize, could have afforded to live in these now high-end communities at the time they were constructed, but when they were excluded by explicit policy of the bank, the realtor, and the developer. It wasn't just the federal government, of course. Bank, the real estate industry, and development industry all collaborated in this process.
Some here don't know what Jim Crow is, so please explain.
Okay, Jim Crow is just a term that's used to describe segregation. After the Civil War, we had a period called Reconstruction, in which federal troops ensured the safety and civil rights of African Americans throughout the former slaveholding states. That period of Reconstruction ended in 1876. 1876. With a deal that was made, perhaps you read about it because it's a time we had a problem in the Electoral College similar to the one that some tried to create in the after the 2020 election. A deal was made between Democrats and Republicans to pull federal troops out of the South. And once federal troops were pulled out of the South, protecting the former slaves, a period of almost re-enslavement began, in which, and as you know, institutions were segregated. We had a Supreme Court ruling that said it was okay to have separate facilities for blacks and whites. Well, that segregation that was imposed beginning in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century is referred to as Jim Crow laws.
I think that is, there's some, all right. I believe a large number of investors, local, out of state, country are buying up properties with cash and limiting home ownership opportunities to minorities. Are you seeing this trend nationwide? And what can we do as agents other than point out to our sellers the difference between owner and investor offers?
Yes, it is happening nationwide. It's an enormous problem. And really, the only solution to this is to increase the amount of housing that we build, because housing has become a bubble. It's become it's like selling, orchids in Holland and in the 1,000 years, hundreds of years ago. And developers and speculators, not developers, the speculators are taking advantage of this and buying up homes in the expectation that the bubble will continue and they'll be able to resell them later at even higher prices than they're paying now. We have an enormous housing shortage everywhere in the country. Mm-hmm. And unless we end this bubble, and we're not with the speculators that are going to continue to do this. I don't know how you can prevent them from buying a home. I don't think you can get a seller to turn down a higher offer because it's a socially good policy to turn down such offers. And so it's happening all over the country. In some cases, it's not just buying up homes at market rates, but in the aftermath of the burst of the 2008 bubble, Fannie Mae was left holding thousands and thousands of properties that had been foreclosed. And they dumped them in auctions. They were bought up, these homes were bought up by speculators at a tiny fraction of what they were worth, and then resold or rented at market rates, making enormous profits, and that's still going on today.
How about looking to even out the playing field by also looking at the educational aspect, allowing kids from poor neighborhoods in the cities to be bused to schools in the suburbs?
Well, we used to have a busing program, as you know, in the 1970s and 80s, and it was ended because of a political backlash against it. But the reality is that most parents legitimately want their children to go to neighborhood schools. The solution is not to try to bus children to other neighborhoods. The solution is to make schools in all neighborhoods good, and the only way that can be done is if we desegregate all neighborhoods. Let me add one other thing, Christine, if I may.
Yes, sir.
In many cities in this country, African-American children in low-income neighborhoods live so far from high opportunity places that busing is a solution only for very, very few. And what it does is it buses children from low-income segregated neighborhoods into inner ring white suburban neighborhoods, still leaving most suburbs untouched. And what it leads to is a concentration now of Black and in some cases Hispanic children in a few suburbs that are closer to the neighborhoods from which the children are bused, and leaving other neighborhoods untouched. All right, well, thank you very, very much. I appreciate this invitation, and good luck to all of you.